So, Marsha Lederman, most people don't need an introduction to Marsha Lederman. She's been a journalist in this country for a long time, doing as a reporter, a news reporter, a broadcaster, a talk show interview, a CBC host. She's worked for all the major outlets, for CBC, for National Post, for Globe and Mail, and for the last 15 years, she was the arts reporter for the Globe and Mail, and she's recently moved into a position as a national columnist, a new position. Congratulations. Wow. Thank you. And we are here to talk about her book, about the Holocaust. This is an incredibly ambitious book in that it takes on 3 generations, her grandparents who died in the Holocaust, her parents who survived in the Holocaust, and her experiencing the repercussions of that history in her own, in this generation, but then also your son, maybe 4 generations you could say this book takes on, and all the history of that horrible time. And so I wanted to ask you, the first thing I've never asked you is, how long did it take you to write this book?
Well, my standard answer to that is 55 years. But yeah, I mean, I was collecting this information for many years. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
We should have a nice welcome before we dive into the Holocaust.
Yeah. This library is gorgeous, and this town is beautiful. And yes, I love the bookstore, and I, of course, bought a book, and I bought some sweaters today on 2nd Avenue. So.
And we've hit so many restaurants. We've done the Bistro Nevados, Yamagoya, Mugshots, Freshies, or
And I bought a chocolate bar from the chocolate place for my son to bring home to him, but I ate it today. So he won't be getting anything. So what was it? Oh yeah, how long did it take me to write this? So my original plan, I really started conceiving of this in a serious way in like 2018, I guess, and I planned a 6-month book leave in 2020. That was the plan. And in fact, I began the book leave the 2nd week of March 2020 and had a flight booked to Warsaw, Poland on March 12th, 2020, which I canceled at about 3 a.m. on March 12th, 2020, because the previous day was the day the WHO declared a global pandemic, and then the US president, he who shall not be named, at the time closed the US borders with Europe that night. It was a Wednesday night, and I had my bag by the door, and I was freaking out. I was supposed to go on this major trip to Poland and Germany, which was really going to be the main part of my book that I'd already published a contract for, or signed a contract for with a publisher. But obviously I couldn't go, and so the book turned into something else. I ended up writing most of it during lockdown. I did go back to work immediately because I thought, this is the biggest story of my lifetime. How can I not be reporting? Even if you're writing about the arts, there was a lot to write about, specifically arts companies really, really struggling with lockdown. So it was an interesting time. I would get up, I was telling Angie this, at 4 most mornings and write until my son woke up, which was at about 7:30, 8. He didn't have to go to school. He was doing school on video. And then I would get him set up, and then I would transition into my Globe and Mail work. And then I did take 2 months off, June and July of 2020, and did a bulk of writing then, and then after that it was just editing and writing on weekends and early mornings. And so I don't really have an easy answer to that.
And I asked that question knowing that, because I feel that's true of every book. It took you till however old you are then.
Yes,
right? And
it took me until...
It took you from when you were 5 and your mom, you asked your mom what happened to your grandparents, and you got that horrifying answer. That's how long it's taken you to write this. Or that's when you started researching this book, in a sense. It's your whole life's work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this book to me starts, there's this moment, and Marsha she meets her first good friend. She goes off to kindergarten, she gets a really great friend, she goes to their house, they have wonderful grandparents, and she comes home and says to her mom, "Where are my grandparents?" And your mom tells you very bluntly that the Germans hated her parents and gassed them. And that's how you find that out as a 5-year-old, they're dead. And
she used the term gas showers.
Gas showers. She put them in the shower and there was gas.
She said, the Germans hated the Jews and your grandparents they killed your grandparents with gas showers. Something like that, I'm paraphrasing.
It's, is that fair to call that your first conscious moment of interacting with the Holocaust as such?
Yes, although it was always around our house. But you know, you grow up and you think your experience is everyone's experience, right? You don't realize that what's happening in your house is any different from what's happening in every other house. But in my house, there were always stories about the war. That was how it was put. And you couldn't not eat the food on your plate because of the war. And, you know, if I asked my mother, I don't have a conscious memory of this, but if I asked her about the tattoo on her forearm, I would have received an answer about the war. But that particular answer is my first conscious memory of it. And of course, after that, I didn't learn very much. I was afraid to ask any further questions.
We're going to come back to that being afraid to ask, because that's such a huge part of this book, being afraid to ask the questions. But the next major thing you remember is being at a Jewish camp, and they showed you a film, and they're pushing bodies into a pit. And you talked to a friend later to say, do you remember them showing us this, and was it as traumatic for you? Can you talk about the experience, how old you were, and how you reacted to that film?
Sure, I was 7, so, you know, wise and old, since 5, and I was in grade 2. It was actually Hebrew school, it wasn't camp, but we were, you know, I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week where we learned the Hebrew alphabet, we learned Jewish stuff, learned how to pray, that kind of thing. And one day, without any sort of trigger warning or preparation, would never be done this way now, we were brought down to the basement and, you know, a film was shown to us. And the film, it was probably Night and Fog, or cuts from Night and Fog, which is a very famous Holocaust documentary, but there were scenes of bulldozers pushing naked corpses into pits. Very famous images, which many of you have probably seen. But I was looking at that. That was the first time I saw any picture of this thing that I knew had happened to my parents and grandparents. And when I looked at it, I thought one of those bodies could be my grandmother. That was my thought. And I was really, I was very, very upset. And the same friend with the grandparents is the one who was there with me. And I talked to her about it. I phoned her up as I was writing the book and asked her if she remembered that. She had a very different memory of it than I did. Not very different, but I remember her telling me that I was overreacting. And I said, you know, this is my family story, or that could have been my grandmother. And she remembers another kid running out of the room crying, which I don't remember. And then I wonder, was that kid me? I don't know. It's funny how memory works, huh?
And that's a thread through. I think you have to almost, when you're writing memoir, draw attention to the unreliability of memory. And you do that several times. You'll be like, well, this is something my father did repeatedly, or maybe he only did it once and I just remember it. And so and because they talk so infrequently about the war, you really have to patch it together, and some guesswork involved.
Yeah, and my parents have both died. They were not alive when I was writing this book. My father died unexpectedly when I was 18 years old on a trip, and then my mother died unexpectedly when I was 39 years old, also on a trip. So, more trauma. But I didn't take the time. It's one thing not to have asked my dad, because I was a teenager. You know what teenagers are like. But it's unforgivable that I didn't ask my mother more, that I didn't get the story from A to Z. And in fact, she was in Florida when she died. She called me I called her that day, and we were talking on the phone, and she said she didn't feel well. And I said, you know what, I'm booking a trip to come down. And I gathered notebooks, I gathered my recorder, I was gonna go and get the whole story. I booked a flight, and she died that night, so I never got to go.
But you say it's unforgivable that you didn't ask, but didn't you feel unwelcome to ask? Like, wasn't there an invisible barrier that you felt you couldn't cross to ask, or am I just reading that into it?
I was afraid to hurt them. That was it. Like, and this is a very common story with children of Holocaust survivors. We feel protective over our parents. They've been through enough. We don't want to put them through more, although I put my parents through plenty. But you don't want to harm them any further. And to be honest, I also was afraid of the harm it was going to do to me, what the answers would be. I couldn't stand, and I still can't. It's sort of strange that I decided to write this book and to read so much about it. I've gone through long periods of my life where I've stopped reading about the Holocaust or watching films about it because I couldn't handle it. And I really had trouble doing that with my parents. We watched this, does anyone remember that series Holocaust? It was on in the 70s. I watched that with my parents, and that was sort of the first time I got an idea of what went on, and I couldn't handle that this terrible thing that was being shown on TV had actually happened to my parents. And I had a very similar reaction when I watched Schindler's List with my mother in a theater.
That sounds very painful.
It was very painful. And then when I traveled to Poland with my mother and we went to Auschwitz, I couldn't handle being there and thinking she had to sleep in these barracks and be a slave laborer here. And
I want to talk about Auschwitz. I wonder about the tourism around it, like the idea of going there. Why do people need to go there? It's not even my history, and I don't think I could do it. I can't imagine how horrible and how grim and how devastating it would be. So why do we go there? Why does it exist, the thing where you can go there?
Well, I'm glad it does. I'm really glad it does. And I think that you can visit Auschwitz and learn a lot. And I think you can visit Auschwitz and mourn. And I think that you can also visit Auschwitz and be a silly tourist and take selfies. And that I have a really hard time with it. I don't think I could go now. When I went in 1998, so a long time ago, we went as part of something called the March of the Living, which in fact is just about to happen this year. It happens every year where Jewish high school and university students from around the world travel to Poland, and they go on a tour. It's really awful, but you visit several concentration camps, you visit the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, you visit what remains of certain Jewish cemeteries. You visit a place in the forest where Jews were mass executed during the Holocaust. It's really, really tough stuff. But on Yom HaShoah, which is next week, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day, everyone goes to Auschwitz, and everyone's wearing the same colored jacket. They were blue. I imagine they're still blue. And everyone marches from Auschwitz to Birkenau, which is about 2 kilometers, I think, or 2 miles. And you march silently. People are carrying flags from the countries that they're from. People are carrying Israeli flags. It is the most empowering return I can imagine. So I do support that kind of tourism, if that's the right word, but I also, there are many survivors and children of survivors who will not do that, who will not go, and of course, they should never have to. I will never go to a concentration camp again. I've been to 3, no, I'm not doing it again. It's way too hard on me.
Yeah. So you had those memories of your mom telling you about the showers and then seeing that film, but in some ways, when you really started to actively engage with what the Holocaust meant to you and how it had formed you as a person was when you came to it through your divorce. You went for counseling, and the therapist suggested, tell us how the therapist suggested that maybe your divorce had something to do with who you, or sorry, maybe that was a Freudian slip, how the Holocaust had something to do with who you are.
So it happened once when it was always around some man. So when I had this boyfriend, Jewish doctor, my mother was thrilled when I was in my, trust me, when I was in my late 20s and things were kind of going south. He was at Harvard getting his master's of public health, can you imagine? And we were, sorry, that was a very Jewish way to say that. We were kind of drifting apart, and I was being really insecure, and I went to therapy for the first time. And at some point in this therapy, I had a dream about this guy, and he was naked, and we were on a train. And the psychologist or therapist said to me, "Do you not see the link with the Holocaust here?" And I said, "No, I'm just like, I'm scared I'm gonna lose this guy," which I did, he dumped me. But, years later, when I went through a divorce fairly recently and sort of the catalyst for this book, it occurred to me that a lot of my issues may actually go back to that in a few different ways. I have major abandonment issues. I'm extremely I'm insecurely attached. But also there might be something else going on. There might be something going on genetically that I may have inherited from my parents because of their experiences. And that was something that was getting a lot of attention as my marriage was ending, and it made me think, oh, could there be a link between this intergenerational trauma, this epigenetic intergenerational trauma, and the fact that I was having such a hard time. And I know a divorce is hard, it's brutal, but it felt sort of next level what was happening to me and sort of my inability to get back to life. And I had this therapist, and he also actually wasn't, I had a series of therapists actually at this time, and one of them, it was a woman, suggested, do you want to talk about the Holocaust? Because it's something you put on your intake form. And I said, no, that is not why I'm here. I'm here to talk about my divorce and how messed up I am. But it occurred to me eventually that there might be a connection between the two.
I want to talk more about epigenetics in a bit, but I want to talk about your parents' experience. And particularly, I was interested in your dad. I've read a lot of war novels and war history, but I'd never heard of someone who survived the war the way he did. That seemed like a unique story to me. Can you tell us how he survived the war?
Yeah. I grew up with Holocaust survivors all around me. My parents, the very few relatives I had, and all of my parents' friends. And they all have crazy stories. There's a book, there's a table over there, and thank you to the library for having a display for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Remembrance Day. And there are quite a few books there about Holocaust survival. And every story, it's like, you can't believe it. If it wasn't in a book, you'd think, if it was fiction, you wouldn't believe it. So what happened to my father was, and this is really the condensed version, but he was 19 when the Germans invaded Poland, and he and his parents, an older sister and younger brother, moved from the city he lived in to a smaller place. I don't know why. Maybe they thought things would be easier there. Maybe they were forced to move there, I don't know. But the place they ended up was called Pietrków-Trybunalski. And he was forced to work in the ghetto doing, I'm not sure what. But one day, whoever was in charge said, we have too many of you Jews working here. We're going to kill every 10 of you, or every 5. I heard it 2 different ways. And then they did the count, and my father was one of the people they landed on. He was going to be executed that day. He told the guard that he had a gold watch and that he had more jewels back in the home where he was staying. And he would give this guard all the jewels if the guard would let him live. So the guard told him, go wait over there, go wait in a room. I always pictured it as a little basement bathroom, but I'm sure that's not what it was. And my father could hear what was going on out there, the shots, the executions, not knowing what was going to happen to him. And he had to wait a long time because I think this guard wanted everyone else to leave before he, got his gold watch and negotiated more. And he took the gold watch from my father and he said, go get those jewels, bring them back tomorrow, and you can continue working. So my father went back to where the jewels were. I think it was at their home in the ghetto, but I'm not sure. And we think that his parents and sister and brother were still there. And they told him to go. They knew that there was no way he would be safe after what had happened. They told him to run away. So we would have had to say goodbye to them. I can't even imagine that scene. They gave him the jewels or the valuables. I don't know what was in this package of valuables. And my father escaped out of the ghetto and went to the home of a Polish official that he had heard was would give out false papers for a price. And my father knocked on the door and a woman answered. She was the wife of the man, and she let my father in, which in and of itself is incredible. And when the man said no, that he wasn't going to issue the false papers to my father for whatever reason, this woman begged her husband to do it. So I owe my life to this woman. Don't know who she is. I never will. So my father got false papers and a new name. His name had been Jacob Lederman, and he became Tadek Rudnicki, Polish Catholic. And he took these papers and he took a train into Germany. This detail always fascinated me. A train into Germany. And he got off in a farming area and he got work on a farm. And he lived on that farm for about 2.5 years, pretending to be someone he wasn't, Tadek, and living in fear of being discovered as a Jew. He went to church every Sunday, prayed, didn't know what he was doing at first, but he observed. And he had a little Polish Bible that we found after my mother died with her most treasured things. And that's how he survived the war. And when it was over, when liberation happened, he told the family that he was Jewish. And in his telling of the story, they were shocked. But the story is lived in a different way in Germany.
And you talk about him being in his 20s, and part of what he would have had to hide was the fact that he wasn't circumcised.
Oh yeah, I mean, that was huge. If you were a man, if you were a Jewish man at that time, you were really in a terrible situation. You could not let your penis be seen because you were circumcised and other people were not circumcised at that time. So I imagine him being like, maybe interested in girls, but he wouldn't have been able to do anything. Even having to go to the bathroom, out in the fields all day. I don't know how we accomplished it, and these are questions I never asked.
And there's a part where he pretends he's mentally handicapped in some way, so it's easy for him to hide. But my son's interested in history, and he said, well, didn't the Nazis kill the mentally handicapped people as well? Like, wouldn't that have put him in danger?
Yes,
Yeah.
but this was in the dying days of the war, when they were looking for specifically for people to fight for the Germans. So this wasn't when they were sending people away to be murdered. And yes, people who were disabled in any way, including people who had mental health issues, were murdered by the Nazis. But at this point, this was we're talking 1945, I believe, in the late days of the war. And the Germans were looking for anyone at this point who could fight for them. And so they came to the town looking for able-bodied men, and my father pretended he was unable to fight because of mental deficiencies, and they believed him. They made fun of him.
And so you have all this story, even though you didn't ask questions. You have quite a few details about that story, but you don't know the names of the people. You couldn't get a hold of those people if you wanted to, whereas you could have asked that question, right? Did you say, am I remembering that he mailed them presents for the rest of his life?
Yeah, he mailed them presents every year at Christmas. My dad would mail a big package to Germany, and stupidly never asked. But we found a diary of his that he took, that he went to Poland in 1979. He went back to Poland, and Germany in 1979 to see who he could find. And he went on his own. This was not on a big organized trip like I did it. It was really, really difficult when he did it. And when he was there, he visited the farm and the family, and he wrote their name in this diary. So we started looking for these people. He'd spelled the name wrong, so that was a problem. But we did find them. Spoiler alert if you read the book.
Some people here have already read it because I see book club people.
Yeah, so we did find them, the Flotmeyers, and that was who my sisters and I were going to visit when we were supposed to go in March of 2020. And they were going to show us the room where my father slept, and they were going to take us to the church, and they were going to, tell us everything that they could remember. So the person who was a boy at the time that my father was on the farm, he was like 8 or 9 at the time. He's now an elderly man, but he remembers my father. And he remembers my father coming back in 1979 for that trip as well.
Why wouldn't they have felt betrayed when they found out that he had lied to them about his identity?
I don't know that they felt betrayed.
I said, why wouldn't they feel betrayed?
Oh, why wouldn't they? Oh, good question. Maybe they did. But the twist is that I believe, based on kind of communication we've had with them, I believe that the story in their family has become that they knew he was Jewish and that they were hiding him as an act of, as a kind act, a heroic act.
And do you believe that, or do you think it's impossible to know what's true? Impossible?
My father absolutely did not think that. I'll tell you what I think is that they must have suspected. How could they not have? Why was this 20-year-old, 22-year-old, healthy, strong man not fighting in the army? Who knows? I'll never know. But it is, and they are heroes. If it weren't for them, we wouldn't be around. But it is interesting to see how they tell that story in their family.
Do you remember how you did? I met you in Salt Spring when you were doing your tour. Do you remember what you signed my book with?
No.
You said, you will recognize parts of this journey. And then I read the part, the husband disappearing into himself. And you say you say you're not allowed to almost feel like you feel guilty for experiencing the pain of divorce. You're like, oh, it's only a divorce. It's just a divorce. My little divorce. Like, you constantly minimize that kind of pain because your parents lived through the Holocaust. So how can you complain about a divorce? Do you still feel that way? Do you feel like you're not allowed to complain about terrible, horrible pain that you suffer?
Yes, I do. It's a real thing. Growing up in my household, we weren't allowed to complain about anything because what could we have to complain about? We had food on the table, we had warm beds, we had a nice house. No one was running after us and trying to send us to a gas chamber. I mean, that was the that was the unsaid bit of it. But you understood that, if I wanted, I don't know, I remember I really wanted a Sweet 16. This was back a long time ago when they did Sweet 16s, and I wanted it, at some fancy place, and my parents said, we'll throw you a party in the basement. And I said, that's not good enough, and they basically, rightly so, thought I was a horrible person. And I was, sulking about that or sulking about not having designer jeans or whatever. And they would have none of it. Like, how dare you complain about this? Do you know what was happening to us when we were 16? Not my father, but my mother. And it was mostly unspoken. It was kind of understood. And I understood it too. So even then, I never felt right complaining. I still did. But I never felt like it was okay. And so when I was going through this divorce and all of this stuff was coming up, about intergenerational trauma, and I was reading about epigenetics and these studies, but I was also, somehow, I got it in my head that if I read a lot about the Holocaust while I was going through this terrible time, it would somehow bring my parents to me. Like it would be I would feel their presence, not in like a spirit, like a dee way, but you know, that I would feel them close to me and that would be comforting. And the other thing was, I felt it would give me perspective. Like I thought, this is bad, you know what, it's not so bad. Think about what your parents went through. And I really had a hard time getting past that. I wouldn't say I'm past that completely, but one thing that really helped me was a book by a woman named Edith Eger. She wrote a book called The Choice, Embrace the Possible, and she's an Auschwitz survivor. And I actually read her book because someone had said that her story reminded them of my mother's story. And she was in Auschwitz at the same time as my mother, and that was another thing I was doing. I was reading a lot of contemporary accounts, what was happening to other people while my parents were in those same places, trying to investigate what my parents had experienced. But in her book, she survived the war, she became a psychiatrist, she's a brilliant woman, and she absolutely rejects this notion that just because your problems aren't Auschwitz level, that they're not valid. So it really did help me to read her book.
I found that super interesting because I'm the kind of person who loves books, and I find all kinds of solace in books and answers in books. And so I will, if someone's suffering with something, I will give them a book about that topic. And it only occurred to me one time somebody's mother was dying of cancer, and I gave them the book, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, where somebody's mother is dying of cancer. And then went away and thought, oh no, maybe there's some people who don't want to do that. Maybe some people don't want to read about someone dying of cancer when their mother's dying of cancer. But for me, I get it. You went into exactly what you were living, the most painful thing to I don't know, what to do what?
Well, I wasn't reading divorce books. I was
No.
having a hard time with that.
Yeah.
I decided to go like full on.
But in the sense that you were seeing yourself in the we haven't even really talked about epigenetics precisely, but people were listing the characteristics of what people are like when their parents were in Auschwitz or their grandparents, and you were finding really comfort in being like, well, I'm like that for a reason. Other people are like that too, whether it's abandonment issues or cynical or pessimistic or nervous.
Yeah, so that was another thing. So one thing, I was reading all these Holocaust stories, A, to try to figure out what happened to my parents, B, to give myself the perspective of what I was going through wasn't so bad, and C, I was reading all of these studies that some of them were quite new, and some studies go back to like the 60s. Canada's actually been a leader in this area, studying intergenerational trauma and specifically for children of Holocaust survivors. And the new thing that was happening as this was going on in my life is that these studies were coming out that showed this might be happening not just because, you know, my parents raised me poorly or, you know, they were too messed up to raise me in a way that wouldn't mess me up, but that there was actually something happening biologically, that when you experience a great trauma, there is something that happens to you epigenetically. There's a marker that appears on your genes. And what some of these studies were finding is that those markers, those chemical markers, were present in the children, in the offspring of the people who had experienced the trauma, which is astonishing, right? I mean, it's not proven, there's still a lot of studies about this. The implications are huge.
And the implications in Canada for residential school survivors and their descendants.
Exactly, and that's something I write about as well. Like, I feel like there's so many parallels and, you know, very sad and unfortunate parallels, but I feel a lot of kinship with descendants of residential school survivors and victims. because they are dealing with the same thing. And there have also been studies about descendants of slaves in the US and descendants of the Holodomor, the intentional Ukrainian famine. So a lot of these studies are happening, and they're showing that there are effects intergenerationally. The question is, are these effects being transmitted through your genes, like biologically, or is it happening because my parents were, you know,
Certain way.
a certain way? Understandably, you don't get through that unscathed, and maybe they were overprotective or whatever, maybe not able to be there for me in a way I needed them to be there for me. So I was reading a lot of these studies and finding that a lot of the other children of survivors had a lot of the same shticks as I did. Like, we're pessimistic, like to the extreme, very insecure, very scared about what's going to happen. Even when things are going well, you know, the other shoe is going to drop. I met children of survivors who, you know, if they were at an event like this, they would come in, they would acquaint themselves with all the exits, and they would pick a seat where they could get to an exit quickly in case something goes wrong. And, you know, and also a lot of them have attachment issues. A lot of them have issues in relationships, which I do.
So
apparently.
do you feel like working through your family's history and writing the story and learning about the Holocaust and learning about epigenetics and intergenerational trauma and articulating it all in this really complicated book and doing that work, does that change any of that? Like, does that make you somehow be able to resist those tendencies that you just described and like fix the intergenerational trauma? Is that a thing that can happen?
Well, my main concern, like, I feel like it's too far gone with me. The damage is done. My main concern is my son, who is now 14. And I became sort of obsessed during this period with ensuring that he wasn't messed up the way I was messed up. And one of the ways that I tried to protect him from this was not to talk to him about the Holocaust, was not to tell him about his family history, because of the way it had been communicated to me so poorly and so bluntly. I didn't want to do that to him. So I didn't talk about it. At least I didn't think I talked about it. One day he was preparing for his bar mitzvah, which is something that happens when a Jewish boy turns 13, he has a bar mitzvah. It's like he becomes a man. Reads from the Torah, which is the Bible, and gives a little speech at the synagogue. It's a big deal. There's a party if it's not a pandemic. I sent him to Hebrew school to prepare for this, and he came home one day and I said, well, what did you learn today? And he said, oh, we're studying the Holocaust this month. And I just kind of froze, and I thought, oh boy, here it comes. And I got some time to gather my courage, and I said to him, you know what, Jacob, I need to talk to you about this. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They survived the Holocaust. And he said, I know. So, but then it became like, how do I talk to him about it? Because I need to, without freaking him out the way I was freaked out. And this was actually something that an Indigenous artist who I write about in the book, we were sort of having this kind of parallel journey. His father was a residential school survivor. He taught me about the power of story. And I thought about that a lot, and how stories can communicate so much without necessarily all the brutal facts. And there are different ways that happen, but the book ends with one of those stories, and how I was able to talk to my son about the worst thing in a way that I hope doesn't mess him up completely.
Parenting is hard.
Parenting is hard. Notice I said,
Hopefully.
mess him up completely.
Hopefully and completely.
Oh, yeah,
Double adverbs it. So I like reading the personal story where you talk about your divorce and how hard it was and what you tried to do to protect your son and to get through it, because I like reading those kinds of women's stories. How hard is it to write that personally when your husband's in the writing community and you're in the writing community and it's kind of a small world and your husband knows how to read? Things like that. Ex-husband, sorry.
Yeah. So I don't name him, but if you live in Vancouver and you probably know who he is, and that's fine. I did not go into any detail, and I told him this when I was writing the book. We're actually pretty good with each other. We're good co-parents. We've kind of come out the other end of it. But what I said to him was, anyone who reads this book, what they'll know that they didn't know before was that the split was your decision, his decision, and that I was heartbroken. And he said, well, that's true, which is true. I was devastated, and what I focused on in this book was not what he did, but how I was dealing with it, how I was responding to it, and how I was having such a hard time with it. So that was kind of the rule as I was writing it for myself, to protect him in a way, but mostly to protect the kids, because we have a son together, and he also has 2 children from his first failed marriage, who I love. You know, I love those kids. They were my stepkids, and I wanted to protect them. They don't need to know the details, and I don't think the details were relevant, actually, for this story. So there are no details other than how absolutely messed up I was. And that was my rule as I wrote.
Can you read those 2 pages about that part of the book, kind of?
Yeah, so as I was going through this project, I mentioned Edith Egger's book. It was a huge help to me. Another book that was a huge help to me was Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which I imagine a lot of you have read or are familiar with. And these became sort of touchstones for me. And I'm going to read a little bit about those 2 books and how they helped me. This is kind of a more positive passage. Viktor Frankl's book, which is a memoir and a contemplation, emphasizes that we cannot always control our circumstances. Terrible things will happen. The one thing we can control is how we respond to these events, to this suffering, however horrific, even Auschwitz-level horrific they may be. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, Frankl wrote. I read passages like this with some mortification, knowing that I had not risen to my circumstances, my little heartbreak. I had not been proud of my behavior as my marriage was falling apart, in particular, the inability to even pretend that I was okay so that my son wouldn't suffer. And yet here I was again, reading about Auschwitz and thinking about my stupid divorce. In the preface to the 1992 edition of his book, Frankl wrote that he had wanted simply to convey to the reader, by way of a concrete example, that life holds a potential meaning under any conditions, even the most miserable ones. This notion that I did have some control, that I did have some agency, maybe not in the eruption of my marriage, but in how I would respond to it, was the reminder I had needed. Edith Egger had learned this from Frankl too, and his wisdom had guided her. Our painful experiences aren't a liability, they're a gift, she wrote. They give us perspective and meaning, an opportunity to find our unique purpose and our strength. Now they were both guiding me. And not just them. I could hear my parents' voices rising up from Frankl's pages. They had been with me all along, helping me to rise. A central theme of Frankl's book is this philosophy from Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. The question was not just survival, Frankl said in an interview, but there had to be a why of survival. Something or someone for whom to survive. Ella, my aunt, and Gutcha, my mother, had been each other's whys. Each was crucial to her sister's survival. They were in Auschwitz together. And now Jacob, my son, of course, was my why, but so were the birds outside and the trees. So was kayaking with my friend Josh, with curious seals popping up from the still twilight ocean water around us. So was dancing around my living room to Ray of Light, or bombing around in my 10-year-old Honda blasting Beautiful Day. Or, slightly less embarrassingly, feeling like a kid again, zipping along the seawall on my bicycle. So was an excellent book, or a very cold glass of Sauvignon Blanc. So was my cat. So was I. I was also my why. Primo Levi, weak with thirst, shortly after arriving at Auschwitz, broke off an icicle to satisfy this need, only to have it snatched away from him by a cruel guard. The story is recounted in Levi's memoir, Survival in Auschwitz. Levi, astonished, asked the guard, "Why?" The guard responded, "Here there is no why." I was not living in Auschwitz. There were whys all around me. I was swimming in them, but I'd been so immersed in my self-pity, why oh why had this happened to me, that I forgot to notice. It was time to come up for air. The heart is a bloom. Still driving that Honda, by the way. It's now 13 years old.
Thank you so much for your book and for coming here and for sharing so generously with us. I'm going to ask you 2 quick questions, and then you will have an opportunity to ask a question if you want. And then after that, you can go sit at the book table where people can visit you and you can drink your wine. And I will announce next year's lineup. So I have two little questions. You talk about to survivors, children are not just children. What does that mean? What are children to survivors of Holocaust?
We are children, but we are their parents and their sisters and brothers who were murdered. We are their families who were destroyed, and we are a symbol of our continued existence. There was a massive effort to extinguish us from the face of the earth. So when you had a child as a Holocaust survivor, that was a victory, and a child.
And a fuck you to the Nazis, you say.
And a fuck you to the Nazis.
Yes. That's a lot to be. Is that pressure? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure. And a lot of children of survivors are super achievers, like very high achievers. Not really in my family.
Right. She hasn't achieved a thing, really.
But they've done very well, and we were pushed to do very well, and pushed often to certain areas that would be secure. If you're a doctor, if you become a doctor, you'll make a good living, but you'll also be a doctor. Someone will always need you and what you can do. And that was there. That was really real for me.
So you became a writer.
So I became a writer. I'll tell you what my parents really wanted me to be. My father wanted me to be a legal secretary. Why? So I can meet a lawyer and marry him.
So on our drive from the airport, I was saying, I'm fascinated by your dad's story, and I was saying how it would make such a good novel, and Marsha was like, I'm not writing about this world war anymore, I'm not writing about any more wars. So tell us if you're going to write something fun. Do you think you'll write something fun? What would you like to do next?
The next book is not going to be fun, I'm sorry to say. It's going to be about returning to a homeland if a homeland is troubled and not really your homeland, because I am going to Poland and Germany. I'm going now this summer.
COVID trip.
the post-COVID trip is going to happen and I'm going to write about it, but it's going to be about more than that. So that's more of a bummer.
You're
But-
making her tired.
Sorry. But the next book, I hope, will be some crazy, fun novel that has nothing to do with war, or definitely the Holocaust, but might have something to do with divorce, because divorce can be fun too, because it's a new beginning.
New beginning.
Yeah.
Here's to new beginning. Should we cheers?
Here's to new beginning.
Would anyone else like to ask Marsha a question? Yes.
I do, hi. Thank you so much.
I'll repeat it so everyone can hear.
Okay, thank you. It's been lovely. I'm just wondering, as a writer, how you found a permission and an entrance, like how you found a way to start this command story.
So just in case anybody didn't hear in the back, how she found a way to start this story, how she found her way into such a big topic.
So, that's a great question. Thank you, and thank you for engaging with it. I have this tendency to be in a happy place, a normal place, and suddenly I'm in the war zone, or I'm in some kind of scenario that is Holocausty. It happens a lot. And that was initially, I thought, a great way to start the book, because it, initially the book was going to start with me being in New Zealand, and I was in New Zealand because the editors of my newspaper had recognized that my life was falling apart and I was really, really sad, and they sent me on this trip. Go write about wine in New Zealand, right? Thank you, Globe and Mail. So I was at Mount Cook and I was looking up at the stars. Like, it was incredible, and I looked at the stars and I thought, I wonder what the stars look like in Auschwitz. That's what I was thinking. So that was initially how I started the book. And then COVID happened, and I changed the opening of the book to incorporate COVID, because COVID became a part of the story. But again, it was a different scenario where I was looking at something and the Holocaust came to mind. In this case, it was looking across the street at the playground, and the playground had been caution taped off. No one was allowed to play there. And my son was looking out the window with me and said, I just want to go out and play. And that was heartbreaking. But then I thought, what would it have been like in the war if your kid is standing there and saying, I wish I could go out and play, but they couldn't go to the playground because they were Jewish and they weren't allowed, and they could see all the other kids out on the playground. How much worse would that have been? So that was how I started the book. The stars in New Zealand made it later, but I felt like that was a good way to weave everything in, like the divorce, the COVID, the Holocaust. Happy.
Anybody else? Other questions?
I have one question. You mentioned in 2020 you were going to take that trip to Germany and Poland with your sister or sisters, or so how many siblings did you have? Just one?
So
The question, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the question is, I mentioned I was going on that trip with my sisters. I have two sisters, that was a question. They're much older than I am. They love when I say that. And I love them dearly. They're 10 and 17 years older than me, so there's a big gap. I was 4 when my oldest sister got married and left the house, so we basically did not grow up together. But we are going together, the 3 of us. Again, they both live in Ontario, so we're meeting up. I'm going to Poland by myself, but they don't want to go back to Poland. But we're going to meet in Germany, the 3 of us. And did you have a part 2?
Well, yeah. So this is the question. So we know from larger families that siblings often have very different understandings of what's happened and their relationships with their parents and their whole history of their family. So is it similar with your 2 sisters, or was their experiences different because maybe it wasn't started so traumatically?
That's a
Just
super
wondering.
interesting question. So it says often siblings will have very different experiences of the same event, and is that the case with Marsha's family? Do her sisters have a different idea of their parents, and their Holocaust, and their upbringing, and all of that?
Yeah, that is a great question. So because of that age gap, I think that my sisters and I experienced very different home lives with our parents. My oldest sister was actually born as a displaced person in Germany. My parents weren't in a DP camp, they lived in an apartment. It's now a furniture store, I found out this morning actually. So her memories of growing up with my parents are different from mine. I think my parents were so delighted with her, with themselves, with their lives, with each other, I mean, and with their lives, and then they moved to Canada. It was all like happy stuff. And she was, like I said, the symbol, this FU to Hitler. And then my next sister, I think same thing, it was 7 years later. By the time I came around, my parents were in their 40s and they were exhausted. And I say this as someone who gave birth at 42. I know how tired I was and am, but they've been through a lot. And I think that they just didn't have the same kind of energy or excitement or drive to parent me. They were lovely people and good parents, but it was a different kind of experience for me. I was not planned. My father loved telling everyone that. She was an accident. And I was also their last hope for a son, which also didn't happen. So I was a surprise and a disappointment. But to your question, yes, my sisters have told me that their experiences of growing up with my parents were different than mine. And I don't think they were affected the way I was.
I like when you mentioned being a mom at 42 now. It reminds me how much I like the way your view of your parents change once you become a parent. Like how much more empathetic towards your parents you were once. You're like, oh.
Oh my God. But you know what? Like my mother died 2 years before I had my son. So I never even got to say to her, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Now I get it. I made your life so miserable. Also, what was my first word? Which I don't know.
You didn't ask any questions.
I didn't get no, which is really too bad. Me,
Ask
and I
questions.
ask questions for a living.
Today she got to ask Judy Bloom questions.
I
interviewed
did.
Judy Bloom today. Isn't that cool?
That was very cool.
Yeah. Okay, so now, thank you so much. Let's have a big round of applause for Marsha first. And now we're going to stick around, and the Heartbreaking Sirens are going to play some more, which will be delightful, and you can buy beer and wine, and you can visit with Marsha.
Can I just say something? First of all, Angie, thank you for that amazing interview. That was just the easiest conversation. It's not an easy thing to talk about always, like all these things. And thank you to everyone for being such an attentive audience. And thank you to the sponsors and the hosts for this beautiful event. I'm really moved that you brought me to Fernie to talk about this important topic, and it means a lot to me, so thank you.
Because this is our last booked event for this year. First, I want to say it's really nice to see it full in here. We did have trouble getting our in-person crowd back when we started booked back up after COVID, and I was thinking, what are we going to have to do to get people back? Because it's nice to have a crowd for our authors, so this is lovely to see the place full. Thank you so much for coming back. Next year, we have a great lineup. We're going to start in the fall with Giller Prize winners, Suzette Mayer, just to start things off. And then Bradley Summer is going to come from Calgary. He wrote a book called Fishbowl. This is his previous book. It's about a fish that falls down an apartment building, and as it falls down, it sees all the stories in each window. And that was translated to many, many languages. And he just had a new book called Extinction, which is environmental dystopia novel, and he's going to come in the winter, and then in the spring we're going to have Canada Reads winner Joshua Whitehead. So another great year. We couldn't do it without the library and without Park Place Lodge as a sponsor for all of our writers stay for free at Park Place Lodge. So we're very grateful to the Zimbrowskis who are normally here. So thank you everybody, and thanks for supporting us this season.